every major form of kind of liberal theology is just this idea. So a radical feminist, a 4B feminist, would say society is structured by men to oppress women. Women are the oppressed class. And that's how you get some of these ideas like marriage is a dynamic designed by men to achieve the ultimate male sexual fantasy and to obtain as much sex as possible.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
This video is adapted from a section of my book, The Woke Mind, The Twisted Psychology of the Social Justice Movement, available on Amazon, combined with clips from the Reality Therapy Podcast. The current state of radical feminism being pushed in universities is starkly contrasted with the earlier forms of feminism. First and second wave feminism were focused on removing any barriers between women and full equality under the law and equality of opportunity, such as women's suffrage, fighting against sexual harassment and sexual violence, and banning workplace discrimination on the basis of sex. That is a liberal conception of feminism, which is equal rights between the sexes, and nearly everyone in America supports these principles. This discussion will focus on radical feminism, which rests on very different principles. Contemporary radical feminism has been shaped by socialist Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in 1949, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch in 1970. The postmodern version of feminism focused on consciousness raising by seeing oppression everywhere. Any women who rejected this approach were said to have internalized misogyny or internalized patriarchy. Like other forms of social justice, there's no right way to disagree. Feminist professor Lucinda Finley argues rationality, abstraction, and preference for statistical and empirical proofs over experiential or anecdotal evidence comes from life experiences typical to empowered white males. In other words, facts have a white male bias, according to Professor Finley. Basically, the first two waves of feminism made the case that women should not face workplace discrimination and should be able to hold public office because they can be just as logical and rational as men. Whereas newer iterations of feminism suggest that women are naturally illogical and emotional beings who are oppressed by the idea of rationality and facts. Does that sound sexist? Candace West and Dawn H. Zimmerman tell us that gender differences are not natural, essential, or biological. They are socially constructed. They then argue that one's competence as a child or an adult is judged based on how well we perform our gender. This concept is pulled straight from Judith Butler's ideas, which are laid out in the book Gender Troubles from 1990. Butler is also the mind behind queer theory that has fueled the transgender movement. The common link being shifting the perspective from viewing gender as a biological fact to a socially constructed fiction. Marilyn French claims it has been downhill ever since the formation of the patriarchy nearly 6,000 years ago for women, because they have been increasingly disempowered, degraded, and subjugated by men. She says that men always seek ways to defeat feminism in order to control women and minorities. She says that the only thing that unites men is opposition to women. Her goal for feminism is that men not feel free to beat, rape, mutilate, and kill them. Her conspiracy is that this violence is part of a concerted campaign to oppress women. Here she's not speaking of Saudi Arabia, Syria, or Sudan, but America. As we saw in critical race theory, gross exaggeration is passed off as a form of authenticity that cannot be questioned because a marginalized person is speaking her truth. Going back to Hegel's master-slave dialectic and standpoint epistemology, contemporary radical feminists suggest that because women are oppressed, they have a more accurate view of the world than men. With critical race theory, we see the simplistic idea that white or whiteness is shorthand for bad, while black or blackness is shorthand for good. Similarly, Douglas Murray summarizes the contemporary feminism. Everything that is good is female. Everything that is bad is male. Andrea Dworkin gives us this gem. The normal fuck by a normal man is taken to be an act of invasion and ownership, undertaken in a mode of predation. Women have been chattels to men as wives, as prostitutes, as sexual and reproductive servants. Being owned and being fucked are or have been virtually synonymous experiences in the lives of women. He owns you. He fucks you. The fucking conveys the quality of the ownership. He owns you inside and out. Dworkin and other radical feminists in the 1980s pushed the idea that all heterosexual sex is rape, and all heterosexual men are rapists. While this concept never fully took off, it was diffused into the idea that we now call rape culture, that rape is an acceptable thing in our society that all men contribute to. Don't question this, or you'll be accused of rape denial. Lead editor for the feminist scholarly journal Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Suzanne Denuda-Walters, asks openly in an article in the Washington Post from 2018, why can't we hate men? We have seen trending slogans on Twitter like, all men are trash, or kill all men, They were defended by mainstream media figures like Ezra Klein. But the reverse, all women are trash or kill all women, will be seen as a horrific abuse that would be universally condemned. Should we worry about a double standard, or is it okay because women are victims of the patriarchy? Men's rights activists often begin by listing legitimate issues affecting men, like higher rates of suicide and disproportionately poor treatment in custody battles, and then transform this into an entire worldview that revolves around hating women. This is the mirror image of today's radical feminism, which takes some legitimate complaints and morphs them into a worldview centered around hating men. Philosophy professor Christina Hoff Sommers calls contemporary feminism victim feminism. She states, "There's a lot of hostility toward men and toward women who don't agree with them. There's a willingness, a readiness to censure, to silence people." Sommers describes herself as a strong supporter of traditional liberal feminism based on equality rather than equity, which entails the sort of feminism that won women the vote, educational opportunity, and many other freedoms. She describes this as a push for universal values, an abhorrent concept to postmodernists. She says the brand of feminism that has taken over college campuses is fainting couch feminism. Sommers describes such fainting couch feminism when she gave talks on the need to reform feminism at Oberlin College and Georgetown University. Activists who attended needed trigger warnings and accused her of giving them PTSD. If universities replace the ideals of free inquiry and critical thinking with safety, they'll have lost their reason for being, she says. Fainting couch feminism, with all its antics and psychodramas, is an embarrassment to women and a setback for feminism. I couldn't agree more. Sommers says the typical gender studies textbooks are essentially propaganda. They just don't consider explanations for women's choices outside the theory of oppression. She describes these ideas as conspiracy theories. She points to research that indicates natural differences in men and women across cultures, research that would never be referenced in women's studies or gender studies. She says, "I don't automatically think it's sexism if you find more women going into education, psychology, and social work than computer programming. I don't think we're ever going to have a 50-50 split in the workplace because people have different dispositions and interests." American women are not oppressed, Sommers states bluntly. American society is not a patriarchy. Many believe otherwise because they have placed their faith in activist scholars. The gender scholars in the nation's leading women's studies programs, law schools, and research institutes enjoy a near monopoly on women's issues. They write the textbooks, fashion the theories, and teach the classes. Gender and women's studies departments do not represent the views of Americans or even the typical woman or feminist. Yet these are the dominant ideas forced upon the population. While liberal feminism is very popular with the American population, it's radical postmodern and intersectional feminism that dominate academia.
Right now, you speaking to me will have these deeply internalized beliefs that, yes, okay, she's written a good book and might be worth talking to, but really, I know much better. I am more reasonable. I am more rational. I am more intelligent because I am a man, because you are socialized into these beliefs. Now, I think you would say that's absolutely nonsense and not going through your head anytime.
You know, Judith Butler is feminist, notoriously isolates herself because she's insane. One of my interns once upon a time was in graduate school with her, and she's a nut job.
I definitely believe that.
But like,
after reading her.
But like, there is no monolith of feminism that surrounds her. There are people who like her ideas, and there's a very small subset of people who like her. But like, there's no person who has like some monolithic group.
And what we can actually talk to is for the last 40 or 50 years, feminism has gotten everything it has wanted socially. Like, and this isn't a war against feminism. What I'm talking about is, okay, if over the last 40 or 50 years, everything that those individuals said they needed to be fulfilled in their life, we should be living in a utopia. Yet we're actually seeing higher levels of dissatisfaction than ever before, right? Women are not more empowered in the relationships that they have. They feel more stuck in the relationships they have. They may have conquered toxic masculinity, but what do you do with complacent masculinity? Like, women are actually saying, I'm frustrated that I have to be the masculine presence in the relationship, when for the last 40, 50 years, we've been telling ourselves that male masculinity cannot exist. So you're actually hearing more women from the feminine position say, we don't want to be masculine anymore. We want other people. Well, what does that look like? It sounds like it's the system coming back, the pendulum swinging the other direction. that maybe it wasn't toxic masculinity. Maybe, again, the masculinity definition that you have was based off of primarily seeing the worst in the way of the definition, those who defined masculinity.
So one of the things that you hear, I don't know how much pushback you get from certain segments of feminists, but one of the things I hear is like, it doesn't make sense to talk about men's issues because men have always had all the power in society. Men have privilege. There's no reason for you to complain because you're holding all the cards. Do you get that?
Yeah. It's just like you're living in a cartoon world. And I get it. You look at the fact that every single president of America has been a man, or maybe 2/3, 3/4 of politicians are male. But I get it. That's fair enough. But that isn't the same as saying men are systemically privileged as a group. Just because men are writing the laws, and they often are, doesn't mean the laws are being written for men. If anything, the gender laws are more often written for women. So what I mean by that is men's health in America, one example. If I were to write down all 15 of the top causes of death for you, men are leading in 13 of those causes. Men's health in America is worse than women's across every single group. Like racial group, ethnic group, socioeconomic group is worse. They die more every single age. They live less life in every single country. Just to simply be a male, you are now part of the single greatest demographic factor predicting early death. And to quote Professor Randolph Neese, he said, if you could equalize those male and female mortality rates, you'd do more good than curing cancer. So that gives you a sense of perspective of how big of a problem men's health is in America. However, there are 10 offices, federal offices, tax-funded for women's health in America, various different ones. And I support all of them. But there are 0 for men, not one single office. And every attempt to create an office for men's health has ended the same way, failure. So I understand that if we live in this patriarchy, surely it'd be the opposite way around, where there'd be 10 offices for men's health and none for women. But that isn't the case. And the fact of the matter is, like I said, like, yes, those in power are often men, but that doesn't mean they're exercising that power to help other men, because clearly they aren't. So this idea of a patriarchy is so low resolution and divisive and unhelpful and increasingly wrong. Think about boys in education. Like, they're further behind than women were 50 years ago, and we do nothing. You would have thought patriarchy would make that number one priority. They'd be on that day one. But it's been 3 decades, nearly 4 decades. Nothing's changed. So I refute that theory, obviously. And I think there are new, more progressive, higher resolution, evidence-based, non-political worldviews that we desperately need to use, because it's not taking us anywhere.
So I think a part of that goes along with recognizing that, and it's gonna sound paradoxical, but let me see if I can draw the threads together by the end. Mentioned before and then got off topic that I don't think feminism, it's not targeting men, and it looks like it is. Obviously, it looks like it is, and it has terrible impacts for men. And there's a whole host of terrible outcomes for men that feminists have pushed for and continue to push for and continue to celebrate. Absolutely, 100%, and I'm not denying any of that. However, within the feminists and these feminists who are saying all men are, rubbish and promoting this toxic masculinity, and we see it in Australia too. We've seen numerous newspaper headlines, some of them that I recall recently. There was one that got a bit of perfectly appropriate outrage, photo of a young boy, I don't know, 8 maybe, on the cover of the newspaper with the question, how do we stop him from becoming toxic, or how do we stop him from becoming, I don't know, it was something horrible. And that got a bit of pushback, nowhere near enough, but it got a bit of pushback. And yeah, look, the gender wars are not as big in Australia as they are in the US, largely because it is still really quite anathema to say, the whole gender ideology thing still very much has gripped people. So you really can't even have the conversation about who men and women actually are at the moment in Australia. And that is silencing, I think, a lot of the other debate that you've been talking about, the toxicity between men and women, where it's kind of sort of silencing it. And there are some, people and good on them sort of speaking up in that gender ideology sphere, but I'm not quite sure how much traction they're getting. I don't think they're getting a lot, not as much as they should. However, the harm that feminism is doing to men is is a result of attempting to harm women. Men are merely collateral damage, right? If you can convince a whole heap of women that men are fundamentally toxic and therefore they should not want to date them, they should not want to marry them, they should, try to build a life that is completely independent of actually ever pairing up with a man, then you're setting a whole bunch of women up to either never have children or to be a single mum, which we know is associated with a whole host of negative outcomes for kids. And so that's a form of intrasexual competition, the toxic male, toxic masculinity narrative that is being pushed by so many of the rad femmes at the moment. And that is being pushed hard enough in Australia. Like I said, it doesn't get the coverage because it's not being condemned enough. So it's not, when you don't get pushback, you don't get the explosion. So it doesn't feel like it's a big part of the conversation, but certainly very, very anti-male things coming out on a regular basis. But what those, from the female intrasexual competition perspective, what those narratives are doing is attempting to inverse female mate preferences. So female mate preferences, you ought to be preferencing by default the highest quality man that you think you can attain and retain, right? That means that for the majority of women, you want him to be tall, you want him to be masculine, you want him to be socially dominant. What feminism has gone and done is demonized in men all of the traits that will make someone a good husband and a good father. It's a complete inversion of female mate preferences, encouraging women to reject high quality mates and to potentially reject all mates, but to embrace lower quality mates. And at that point, I'm kind of reminded of something like, I think it was Jordan Peterson who might have said it. Apologies if I'm wrong, but he's something along the lines of, if you think that strong men are dangerous, wait till you see what weak men are capable of. That's kind of captures that intersexual competitive strategy. When women pair up with men that are not the highest quality men and they're mating too far down the mating ladder, you end up with mating mismatches. And one of the consequences of that is high amounts of jealousy and high amounts of interrelationship conflict and things like that. So you just end up with these less healthy relationships. And obviously you also have individual women choosing lower quality partners than what they otherwise could have chosen. And that's the fundamental motive for all of this toxic masculinity narrative. The impacts that it has on men are collateral damage, largely beside the point, a happy coincidence, whatever you might want to call it. They're not the main function of it. And so you're seeing all of this toxicity being spat out at men, but its targets is actually women. That's who the targets of all of that messaging is. It's actually targeting women and completely disrupting female mate choice preferences. And if you look at, you could say a similar thing about the men on the other side to some extent, that, they're spraying out all these toxic things about women, and they're also, therefore, discouraging men entirely from pairing up with, with women. And even if these strategies only work for a while, they only have to work for a while, I guess is what I'm saying. The female reproductive window doesn't last forever. If you're not paired up by the time you're in your late 20s, early 30s, you're really starting to run out of time, and if you're not a very high quality male who isn't, for example, going to be able to accrue the kind of wealth and status that's going to allow you to pair up with a woman who is much younger than you are, because that's the key to men pairing up with younger women. They need to have the wealth and the status to bridge that mate quality gap. If you're never going to get that, then even though the man is not aging out of fertility in exactly the same way the woman is, if he's not able to attract younger mates, then he is aging out of the potential of becoming a father, right? Because if he's not, he might not be fertile anymore, but if as a 40-year-old man, he's not going to be able to pull a 30-year-old woman because he's not going to be able to pull someone 10 years younger than he is, then he may as well have aged out. So it doesn't work exactly the same way for men, but it does work to some extent. The other thing I think that is really muddying the waters on the male side of things that's probably worth mentioning in this conversation as well is that there's a lot of sort of what I would call, genuine men's rights activism, like activism about the rights of men that are currently not being respected and not being spoken about. And that's getting rolled in in terms of the narrative, which of course is, that it's probably another story, but it is absolutely the feminist narrative that dominates the popular press and the news media and stuff, right? So, people who are working in, on what I would consider to be very legitimate men's rights issues are just rolled in with, the most extreme versions of, Andrew Tateism that you can kind of think of, right? So it's just like, and they all get called MRAs, as though the very idea that you would be concerned about men's rights is itself a given social evil, which is a disturbing concept. But it's true, right? Men, being called an MRA is considered an insult by the feminists. The very idea that you might be concerned about the massively high suicide rates among men, or that you might be concerned about the number of men that lose custody of their children, or that you might be concerned about the increasing numbers of men who are being, victims of false accusations of rape and sexual assault and things like that, or you're concerned about the number of men that are homeless, or, the whole host of problems that affect men far more strongly than they affect women, that people are legitimately concerned about, that I'm legitimately concerned about. And, those concerns get rolled into this whole really unhealthy, sort of red pill manosphere that people are quite derogatory of, as a way of derogating any kind of consideration for men's rights. So what you have is this, messaging from men to other men to kind of, to be careful about, to protect yourself from the possibility of false accusations, to be careful about trusting women that you don't know. It's perfectly acceptable for women to receive all manner of messaging about being aware of creepy men. But if you try to send similar messaging to naive young men, of course, you're instantly a misogynist and, an MRA, and you get rolled in with the worst of the worst. So it's also worth sort of, I think, acknowledging that amongst this sort of nebulous manosphere community, we have some serious men's rights activists who are, of course, being tarred with the same brush, if you like, in an attempt to diminish all of those causes. So that's probably worth acknowledging as well.
Women can do anything that men can do, and it's like, well, they are different. Like, we're implicitly different. That's the whole point.
It feels like coming from a Christian perspective, but I feel like also a lot of psychology, like the Gottmans, for instance, like a big part of a healthy marriage is devoting yourself to serving the other person and sacrificing for the other person. There's something in like the contemporary feminist conception where like that type of serving the other person is like you're kind of submitting to like a servitude. In a sense.
They don't like a lot of people don't like that, and I think a lot of therapists who are self-identified feminists, they push for their female clients to do the same thing. Maybe to bring it back to what I do a lot, which is like female-related stuff. Moms it ends up with a lot of women not meeting somebody until later in life, and then finding out that like they can't have kids, or that it's a lot harder than they had anticipated, and so it's like this whole idea growing up has caused so much pain that people don't think about. When we were kids, it was like you go to college, you're going to get a job, get yourself secure, get married, and then you can have a kid. Which again, it's not a bad order of things. Like it's what most people do. But as a result, we end up with a lot of people in their mid-30s that are only just starting to get ready to settle down. And for women, not always, but it can cause problems, and that's hard. I think that's a really hard pill for a lot of women to swallow, because they were told that they could just wait, and that's not always the case.
So take feminism, for example. I'm very anti-feminist. I used to be very pro-feminist. I called myself a male feminist for much of my life. I was misguided. I am not a feminist anymore, because feminism to me is not what it means to a lot of people. There are people who agree with me, but there are a lot of people out there who think, when they hear you're not a feminist, they think that means, oh, you don't think women should have the right to vote. That means you think that husbands should be able to beat up their wives and the cops can't intervene. No, that's not what I mean. That's not even a little bit what I mean. Feminism to me is not simply about equal legal rights for women. Feminism is formalized female-specific narcissism and resentment. It proceeds from a fundamental... Feminism rests on some base assumptions that are never examined, and one of them is that Women are, by their very nature, and always have been from the beginning of time, in a position of exploited subjugation to men, that is the natural state. And without intervention, it will always be that way. So it proposes it, and there are feminists who are listening to this right now who are yelling at the speaker and who are going to leave comments and send you feedback saying nobody believes that. Yes, they do. The reason people get so upset when you talk about it is part of them knows that's actually the core belief and they don't want to have to cop to it. And it proposes that men are inherently, innately, in a hardwired sense, predators of women, that men are fundamentally predators. That's not true. But those are the base assumptions. And it gets elaborated into, yes, I'm afraid the word is applicable, hysterical emotions about, I mean, that's just what I was talking about earlier. Behaviors that 30 years ago, most people probably would have agreed could be properly labeled. That was a sexist response. You know, you really give her a little more respect in this context, right? That's how we'd react to it. That very same statement today is called misogyny, utter loathing and hatred of women. It's not true.
Anything you talk about where men are gathered to talk about masculinity or how they've been wronged by women, the just kind of knee-jerk reaction is this is misogyny. But I've documented quite a few mainstream feminists who regularly use phrases like all men are trash or kill all men. And this is kind of, you know, and mainstream figures like Ezra Klein have dismissed this. Oh, this is just a phrase of social justice. Kill all men is just social justice. Like there's a massive double standard there.
Massive. And again, you know, there are, you know, I'm all for different types of humor and things like that, but you've got to think of the context and the sphere you're in and know your audience. But the bottom line is, and all it is, it's just justifying misandry. Misandry, the hatred, contempt, dislike, prejudice, bias against boys and men because they're boys and men. All it does, all it is, it's justifying or attempting to justify misandry. That's all it is. It takes the demographic of boys and men, treats them as a collective and goes, you're bad. And it's, yes, because the people who oppressed me, the people who've abused me, they were men. And so that means it's okay for me to treat the entire demographic, generally of men, like that. It's prejudice. Do it with any other demographic and see what happens. It's absolute prejudice. That's what it is. And ultimately, what it shows is a hateful attitude. And so people say this, oh, it's just a phrase. We don't mean all. And I'm like, don't say all then. If you don't mean, it's really not that difficult. You know, when I phone the takeaway and I want a pizza, I don't phone and order all the pizzas. So then when they knock on my door and bring me all the pizzas, I don't go, I didn't mean all. Yes, but you said all. It's really not that difficult. If you don't mean all, don't say all. It's like, is it more important for you to come up with a catchy, simple three-worded term than convey accuracy in your message? And the problem that we have is, as I've said, going online, saying kill all men, what it clearly evidences is a hateful attitude about the demographic of boys and men. So then the question we need to be asking is, how might that hateful attitude influence certain abusive, harmful behaviour towards boys and men? And that is an important question I think we need to ask that hardly anybody's asking, because come back to what I said, we don't care. Society just does not care at all. If men have a hateful attitude towards women, there's loads of focus on how that attitude has and may influence harm towards girls and women, but there's absolutely, in comparison, zero thought on how people out there who, and when I say people, I mean women and other men, who hate the demographic of boys and men, how that hate might influence harm towards them. Was it November or December last year? I think she was a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Natalie Rupnow in Wisconsin. She went to the school. She, I think, killed 2 teachers who were both women, and I think 4 other people she shot, or 4 other people were injured. Now, it's alleged, I'm picking my words carefully here, it's alleged that before the shooting, she posted something online where she said, all men are, words to the effect of scum of the earth, they all need wiping and eradicating from the world, and all of this sort of stuff. Shortly after that, she went to school and shot people. 2 of them she killed and 4 of them were injured. To the best of my knowledge, and as I sit here now, the 4 people that were injured, the press have not released whether they were male or female. And even though some people have been suspicious around the online post that she made, is it genuine or is it not? This was December. We're now approaching May. Why has it not been confirmed whether it was real or fake? And could it be because that the mainstream media want to do everything they can to make sure that we don't attach clear misandry to actual harm? And that's the thing. When we're showing any sort of adversity, from harsh words, criticism, horrible abuse to girls and women, there is this automatic assumption that it is motivated by misogyny. And you know what? Sometimes it might be. But there is absolutely, in comparison, very little thought going into, well, when other people, men and women, harm men, is that motivated by misandry? Well, we're not even going to look into that, and we don't care. Why not? Double standard.
The feminist movement started back in the 60s and 70s, and in the 1970, 1972, when Gloria Allred started suing the pharmacy stores for having aisles with gender toys, boys and girls toys separated. And then we saw uprisings of these over the years, but it was always suppressed and pushed back down, and they were never able to really get their foot in the door. Some notable changes are when we had the whole community, whole children, whatever, all the community health clinics getting into the schools, and parents were unknowingly, blindly signing for consent for these folks to talk with our children. And we didn't even know that they were having these discussions with our children about gender and sex and at what ages. And I think that was the start of it. That was in like 2007, 2008 is when that really started to take off, but we didn't know about it. And then there was another point in time with the COVID pandemic where people were at home and social media was just exploding. So I think we had this foundational thing that was just growing in momentum, and then the pandemic exacerbated it to a level that we weren't able to put the lid back on it and suppress it back down. So I think the feminist movement has turned into something that is no longer the feminist movement. But there is a great book. I can't think of the author's name, but it's Don't Let Your Daughters Grow Up to Be Feminists. It's a really good book talking about if this is really what you wanted, then you want equality from the top and the bottom. And men are overrepresented at the top. We know that. And there's reasons why, and it talks about some of those things. But they're also overrepresented at the bottom with homelessness and suicide rates. And is that really what you want, is equality from the top to the bottom? Or do you only want equality at the top? About or think about and talk with your children about. But the feminist movement has evolved. I don't think it's necessarily the feminist movement anymore. I think it is this very divisive culture that you're talking about, not just with male versus female, but also with the color of our skin. It's happening. And I think that the majority of people don't agree with it, and they're now finding their voice and getting more comfortable to speak up and out because they are not scared of the cancel culture anymore. So I think it's going to get better. And I think as Generation Alpha starts to get older, I think they're going to be very bold and emboldened to stand up to this nonsense.
A lot of kind of social justice ideology, and in this case, radical feminism specifically, is trying to change human nature.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I see a lot too is that a lot of women, especially like the more highly educated they are, the more prestigious their jobs are, the more they're surprised by when they do have kids. They really not that they don't want to go back to work, but they're surprised that the priorities have actually shifted. I think a lot of people know that. Like, they know that their kids are going to be more important than their jobs. But I think a lot of women, again, these are like the doctors, the lawyers, the C-suite execs, the really more prestigious jobs that we see, they're shocked that they're just this is just not as important as it once was in my life. And a lot of them get stuck in a lot of these jobs because of the high salaries, because of the debts, because of all these things where they live. And then they're pretty devastated when they're like, I can't go part-time because of X, Y, and Z, and I have to put my kid into daycare full-time. It's something that nobody prepared them for, because we were told, it's not a big deal. Your kids go to daycare. Somebody else will raise them, and you can go back, and you can have your meaningful job. And again, I'm not judging. I have a job I like a lot. It's very meaningful to me. But if I had to pick between my job or my kids are coming first.
I think you definitely see a hysterical response in a certain brand of feminists, even like mainstream feminists who say like all men are rapists, all men contribute to rape culture.
There's no rape culture in the United States. It's not true. It's ridiculous.
It was trending on social media. It was defended by many in the mainstream. All men are trash and kill all men. That was not that long ago.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's perfectly acceptable. Perfectly acceptable. Somebody, men who say no, we're called dangerous. I don't get as much of it as I used to. But I think it's probably the more years that go by that I'm distant from my former leftist social justice circle, I'm just going to get less of it. But I talk about these things really candidly and often angrily. I know that. And the feminists or the race justice people or whoever they are, they act as though that anger itself, that's a man who's going to kill somebody. See how much male rage he has? Right? This is narcissistic abuse. It really is. It's double standards. So if you're Black or if you're a woman, your cri de coeur must be heard by everybody all the time and validated and elevated to a very important, authentic expression of rage, even if it's not justified. But if you as a man or as a white person are constantly subject to this nonsense, these accusations, this exaggeration, when you finally get pissed off enough and say, you know what? You're not a social justice warrior. You're just a selfish bitch. That gets called, that's the misogyny. That's the rage.
Historically, you had women valued for like reproductive capacity, men a lot of times not valued at all, kind of fodder for wars. But, kind of the male role was certain areas of providing, protecting. And it seems like a lot of on the women's side, a lot of the burdens have been cast off. A lot of the privileges have been added. And on the men's side, we're still kind of considered the oppressor, even though that's shifted dramatically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly making less and less sense as time goes on. You're right. If you look at the word patriarchy, it's a combination of father and ruler, or father dominator. It essentially means the father is the ruler of the family. That's what patriarchy means as a word. But if you actually look at fathers and you see the rights they don't have to their own kids, like in the UK, it's certainly not equal rights for fathers. In America, I mean, you could argue there's equal rights in a few states, but nowhere near all of them. I don't understand how, if the father is the ruler, how does he not have the rights to the things that are most important to him, meaning his children? If we're living in a patriarchy, why has generation after generation of men been taken from their homes and used as meat shields in wars, just sent to their death by the millions? Clearly they're the disposable sex. I don't see why that's a privilege. And although there certainly are privileges to men, especially historically, it's just not a one-way thing. It's a mixed bag of advantages and disadvantages, but more so it just seems to be more and more disadvantages for men, and no attempt to really help them at all. The conversation of the patriarchy often looks at, who has the most billionaires or CEOs or prime ministers, politicians or presidents, but that they make up such a small percentage of men. I don't know any politicians or presidents or billionaires or CEOs, but I do know a lot of men that are really struggling with life. I do know that men's health, which impacts everyone, is something that men as a group are massively disadvantaged by. Like I mentioned, I know in education, boys are behind at every stage of education, at every level, in more or less every single country in the West. And that just seems like a much more relevant barometer for understanding equality between the genders than comparing who has the most billionaires or how many women presidents there have been. I get it, that's one measure, but it's not relevant to 99.9% of people who are not billionaires or the president of the United States.
That's interesting. It almost feels like this kind of breakdown in the nuclear family is not an accident. It takes a village model where a lot of critical social justice ideology is explicit in that they're trying to tear down the nuclear family. That this idea of a two-parent home and this family unit is somehow connected to white culture or European culture or Protestant, something like that, and it needs to be deconstructed.
Yeah, like anything that's old is bad and that has to go. And it's like, well, let's look at it before you just, start tossing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, the families are good. And again, I think a lot, I'd like to give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe too much, but it's like, I think it was meant with good intentions where it's like, well, like, let's get your job. Like, let's get you busy during the day. Cause like our kids aren't kids forever. But then as a result, now it's like we flip-flopped all of our priorities. And it's interesting to hear like very, very successful women, because usually they'll say like, no, my kids are absolutely more important. I happen to also have a very successful business, or I also have, whatever.
What I would say is I think that question really comes back to the idea of what are they saying and what are they doing? And this is something that I find really interesting. So we collected some really nice data on this last year, and I'm still trawling through it. And so none of it's published yet. And so forgive me for getting excited about something when it may not turn out that nice. But what the data appear to be suggesting is that there are women who you could say are losing the intersexual competition game, in that they are endorsing radical feminist perspectives but also embodying them. So their choices are to not get married, to not have children, to prioritize their career, and if they do get married, to reject masculine, or to reject any kind of sensible or effective division of labor within their relationship, and things like that, purely because they want to resist any kind of traditional sex role, because they see it as being fundamentally oppressive, and so on and so forth. And certainly we do know that relationships that have a traditional split of gender roles, because what's probably worth pointing out is that in any relationship, it makes absolute sense to split the workload, right? It's completely inefficient for everybody to do everything together and for everybody to share all the jobs. It's far more efficient to say, you do these things that you're best at and you do these things that you're best at. That's how teamwork works, right? And that works in relationships and organizations as well. And relationships that have non-traditional gender roles certainly have lower relationship satisfaction and higher chance of dissolution than relationships that have traditional gender roles. So when you see relationships where the wife works full-time and the dad's a stay-at-home dad, those relationships do report lower relationship satisfaction than the other way around. And again, there should be nothing remotely surprising or politically troubling about that. It should be completely uncontroversial that men receive psychological satisfaction from being able to provide for their families, and women receive psychological satisfaction from spending time with their children, especially when those children are young. When you reverse those roles, you create psychological tension, and it's not that tension can't be overcome, or that it's necessarily fatal for the relationship, but it's a less than ideal situation for the majority of couples than the reverse. So to that extent, yes. But what we also found in our data, as well as people who are both endorsing and embodying these views, which we know leads to lower satisfaction in relationships and lower relationship success, what we also saw were people who were endorsing these views but not embodying them in terms of their own actions and their own behaviors. So these are the people who we would say would be winning the intrasexual competition battle, in that they're investing quite a bit of energy in endorsing all of these strong feminist positions, but with respect to their own decisions in their own life, they're not practicing what they preach. And these are the people who you would say would be, they're the ones who are probably contributing to the narrative, even dictating the narrative. Either way, they're the ones who are winning, right? They're the only ones who can actually benefit from this being a strategy. If your intersexual competition strategy is to promote anti-reproductive behaviors and attitudes and decisions at every step of the way, and then you also go and do that yourself, all you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot. This can only be a successful, reproductive competition strategy if you are convincing other people to do that, then going out and doing the exact opposite for yourself. And we did get quite a bit of data last year that suggested that you can actually identify those two groups of women, those who are both endorsing and embodying the ideas, so doing the bidding of their highly competitive sisters and going, yeah, do all these things, don't have babies, prioritize your career, if you do have a baby, get back to work as quickly as possible, don't breastfeed, don't do this, don't do that, have an abortion every time. That should be the default decision. Who are endorsing all that but also embodying it and falling out of the reproductive gene pool. But there is another group of women who are the ones who are I guess you could say, are the winners, of this game who are spending just as much time endorsing these ideals and saying, yeah, this is all the things you should do, girl power, but also marrying, really nice masculine men and having a bunch of kids and, walking away from their careers when that happens and doing very well, thank you very much. So, we can identify those two groups of women. Whether we can also identify those two groups of men, I would suspect we can, but I don't know. But I think that's the resolution to the question about why the sexes are attacking each other. And the answer is they're not. It looks like they are, but both sexes are highly fixated on intrasexual competition. And the consequences of that is an incredible amount of venom and toxicity getting lobbed across to the other sex. But the function of that toxicity is purely about disrupting the mate choice preferences of their same-sex rivals. That's why it's happening. There isn't a fundamental evolutionary competition between men and women. And one of feminism's great successes has been to convince everyone that there is.
Deciding how we measure equality in many ways is a privilege in its own right. And that line of equality is often drawn by people that are not men. And it's drawn at the top where men are disproportionately seen. But they're also at the bottom too, like homeless, those with addiction, those dying at work, those ending their own lives. They are mostly men too. So men are disproportionately seen at the top and bottom of society. And yet we only ever look at the top, which is just not fair.
It seems like in the modern world, the rules of the game for how you ascend to the top of the hierarchy, the rules have become more feminized in a sense where, as opposed to like this kind of go-getter mentality, maybe like in the 50s that you might have seen people rising, climbing the corporate ladder. It's very much how much you get along with people. And there's certain types of power that are based on your ability to present a certain level of victimhood. So rather than projecting strength, it's how much can I convince you to feel sorry for me? There's these certain types of like kind of unwritten social rules that seem to tilt the scale in the balance towards females and away from males. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like squeaky wheel gets the oil, as they say. And I thought about that too. I mean, obviously, I think a lot about this, and so much of it does seem to come down to squeaky wheel gets the oil. And we know men are less likely to complain or share experiences, especially painful ones, particularly in like experiences of abuse. And we know men are less likely to talk about these things. Men are less likely to open up. But we don't think about how men's lack of opening up also not only impacts him, but also shapes societal views of sexism. Like we know, going back to abuse, men are 2 or 3 times less likely to tell anyone about their domestic violence experiences. And because data is based on those experiences, like the data is not complete because you're not capturing those unseen victims. So it's not just in domestic violence, it's just the fact that men are less likely to be transparent about these things for many reasons. And that obviously has a detrimental impact to those men, but it does create a lopsided view of privilege where we don't talk about these things. And those that do talk about them, like myself, you're shadow banned into oblivion or worse. So, it's interesting, the systemic impacts of men's inability to talk, but more so society's inability to listen to them.
One of my friends from grad school is from Hungary, which is a very sexist country. A group of us were sitting around before class talking, and several of the women talked about how oppressed they were in America by the patriarchy. And my friend from Hungary kind of scolded them. She was like, guys, it's actually really good to be a woman in America. And they all blushed because they knew they had no reason to be complaining about oppression. Throughout the social justice movement, it's generally the most educated, affluent, and privileged people that do most of the complaining about oppression. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my book, The Woke Mind, The Twisted Psychology of the Social Justice Movement, available on Amazon.